I will recount some of my background in Vietnam, including my own personal connection with the Vietnamese Army and Vietnamese people, in order to provide a framework for lessons not always learned by the American side in the Vietnam War. I first arrived in Saigon in August 1954, a 24-year-old second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. I was assigned to work for a gentleman who became something of a legend in Vietnam and elsewhere, then U.S. Air Force Colonel Edward G. Lansdale, who headed a special group called the Saigon Military Mission. My job was to work on pacification and the upcoming occupation by the Vietnamese Army of territories in the South, formerly under Viet Minh control. As a result of Geneva, as many of you remember, the Viet Minh were to evacuate these territories in the South. I could speak French, but I had to climb a very steep learning curve to understand the Vietnamese people and how I might be helpful. Lansdale had been asked by President Eisenhower to do what he could to help the Vietnamese people save South Vietnam from communism. Some of you can remember how chaotic those early days were, with 1 million refugees coming south, the Vietnamese army in disarray, the French defeated and disgusted with themselves but still unwilling to let go, the Vinh Xuyen controlling Saigon and the National Police, Hoa forces and the Cao Dai, with the exception of Trinh Minh Tay, in almost open rebellion, the Army Chief of Staff, General Nguyen Van Hien, threatening a coup, and Ngo Dinh Diem installed by Bao Dai as Prime Minister, but with little control over anything. Many gave the South no more than 6 months to survive, but not Diem and not Lansdale. On the local American side, pessimism was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I remember trying to get some first aid kits from the American Economic Aid Mission to give to Vietnamese Army Psy-War units to distribute in the countryside. I was turned down. The aid folks said, these kits will only fall into communist hands. I first got to know the Army G5 and began learning how Army troops might win the support of the population in those areas under Viet Minh control for 9 years. I took a mixed group of Army officers and civilians to the Philippines to see how President Magsaysay and the Philippine Army had defeated the Hooks. I learned how Magsaysay, when he was Secretary of Defense, converted the Philippine Army from an undisciplined force into an army which had as its credo that they were the servants of the Philippine people, that their mission was to protect, defend, and help their own people. They called it civic action. I became a convert. When the planning began for the reoccupation of Camau and what the Viet Minh called Interzone 5 in the center, it became my job to help the Vietnamese Army plan for these operations. I became the only American observer and informal advisor to both operations, accompanied the troops as they moved in and establishing control. Transformation of the average Vietnamese soldier during these operations was remarkable. For Operation Tuzo in Camau, there was little time to get ready. I witnessed the class in good behavior being given Army truck drivers. After the end of the class, they all barreled out, got into their trucks and roared away, scattering chickens and people right and left. I could see that one lecture was not going to be enough. The main lesson from Operation Tuzo was that more psychological training was needed about not just being a friend to the population, but how to do it. By the time of Chai Phong, I was on very friendly terms with a number of Vietnamese officers, but I wasn't sure where I stood. One day, the French, who also participated in our planning sessions, complained that they were not being allowed to accompany Operation Chai Phong in the center. The Vietnamese said they had a policy of not allowing foreigners. The French pointed at me and said, "But he's not a foreigner, he's our friend." So that's how I would spend several months in conspicuous and civilian clothes. Can I start that again?
Yeah, liberty fine. Okay.
Okay? I'm going to start by the time of Chai Phong. By the time of Chai Phong, I was on very friendly terms with a number of Vietnamese officers, but I wasn't sure where I stood. One day, the French, who also participated in the planning sessions, complained that they were not being allowed to accompany the operation. The Vietnamese said they had a policy of not allowing foreigners. The French pointed at me and said, "But he's a foreigner." Colonel Le Von Kim replied, "He's not a foreigner, he's our friend. So that's how I would spend several months inconspicuous in civilian clothes on the central Vietnamese coast with Operation Chai Phong during the dry season, eating mainly rice, fish, and mangoes while drinking coconut milk, but loving every minute of it. The population was apprehensive at the start because of Viet Minh propaganda that the troops would rape and steal, but troop behavior was impeccable. People were helped, Army nurses treated the sick, roads were repaired, and bridges built to replace those destroyed by war. As the occupation advanced from north to south, word of mouth spread about how the troops were behaving. People began coming out of their homes and voluntarily offering the troops water. The emotional reaction from a population subjected for more than 9 years to Viet Minh propaganda was astounding. Even more astounding was the fact that during the entire operation there was not a single adverse incident between a soldier and a civilian. Later I flew down to Saigon for a couple of days in the middle of Chai Phong. I arrived in the midst of the war against the Ben Xuyen and saw that same pride in the Army troops who were driving them out of Saigon and down into the Rung Sat. Army morale was sky high. Having been told too long that they could do nothing without the French, suddenly the Vietnamese Army was an independent force capable of operating on its own. The fever of true independence finally being realized washed like a wave over everybody. I saw what the average Vietnamese was capable of. I will never forget it. Later in 1962, I would return as assistant director in USAID's Saigon mission to take charge of the civilian side of counterinsurgency. Then most of the Vietnamese Army I dealt with were officers who were province and district chiefs. By decentralizing aid down to the provinces, there was an authentic focus on effective counterinsurgency. As we all know, much came apart after November 1963 through coups and other government changes. Then when American troops intervened directly in 1965, the American command structure became increasingly insensitive to Vietnamese political and social problems. Until, of course, things changed after 1968 and the banner of counterinsurgency was picked up again, as was Vietnamization itself, which should have been started from the beginning. Unfortunately, by this time, the support of the American people had been largely lost. So what are some of the lessons I see for the American side? When General Maxwell Taylor was asked towards the end of his life why we failed in Vietnam, he said we didn't understand the enemy, our South Vietnamese allies, or even ourselves. I would add we didn't understand how to fight that kind of war until it was too late. I will tell one last story to illustrate my point. In 1961, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara asked his special assistant, General Lansdale, to review a chart he had prepared to evaluate whether our side was winning. It was all statistical, the number of Viet Cong killed, weapons captured, and the like. Lansdale said, Mr. Secretary, you forgot something. What? Asked the Secretary. The feelings of the Vietnamese people, said Lansdale. McNamara was puzzled. It was not a factor that he could reduce to a statistic. Thus, the essential psychological and political nature of the conflict was overlooked and remained for too long unincorporated into American views. Why we failed to understand communist revolutionary warfare and its exploitation of nationalism when it had all been laid out by Mao and then Giap is a mystery. We bombed North Vietnam not understanding the adverse psychological effect on the North Vietnamese people, amplified by complete communist control over information. Thus, we confirmed their propaganda thesis that we were a colonialist replacement for the French. We thought that the communist regime would fold, not understanding its willingness to sacrifice every last Vietnamese down to the inner circle of the Politburo. The lesson should have been that ultimately it was only the South Vietnamese who could defeat the North with a better ideology as well as force of arms. I don't think we ever understood how important it was for you, our Vietnamese allies, to develop your own positive political cause beyond pure anti-communism. Collectively, we Americans failed to understand you, the people we were trying so hard to help. how you thought and what motivated you. Instead of being helpful in support of your unity and the development of a genuine democratic political cause, we too often subtracted from that by our own thoughtless actions. Here I think of the destructive impact on Vietnamese morale of so many American troops spending practically unlimited sums on the local economy beginning in 1965, while corrupt goods flowed out the back door of the PX with American connivance. There was a vital need for us as Americans to understand you, the people we were trying to help, and not to impose made-in-America solutions, but to work as cohorts, even as brothers, to help you develop your own solutions. We Americans and you Vietnamese were all too often ships passing in the night. This is not, however, to let our Vietnamese friends entirely off the hook. Some of the good advice that was given was not heeded when the necessity of achieving unity by sacrificing one's personal differences for the greater good got lost, even in the face of grave danger. As for we Americans understanding ourselves, sometimes I think we've achieved so much in this country, we have been so successful as a nation despite our problems, that we have an overdeveloped sense of superiority, which undermines our advisory efforts. We tend to work through vast bureaucratic structures, offering standardized solutions for unconventional problems. Individual initiative too often gets buried in the beehives we construct, which tend to be more devoted to how we deal with ourselves and how we deal with the people we are trying to help. Our views are too often restricted by our own national political perspective. We forget that what plays well within our particular agency or back home may actually hinder what we are trying to accomplish over there. We are a very human people like most of the others, but somehow we fail to explain to our own people what the Vietnam War was really about in human terms, and we are still not doing as well as we should in our current struggles. By not understanding the kind of conflict we were in Vietnam, we were unable to give a credible explanation to the American people. Hence, we lost their support. The truly important lesson is that maintaining support on the home front by talking with the American people, not just at them, about the human side of such conflicts is just as important as tactically winning a long-running, messy military battle in the field. In conclusion, the accounts of Vietnamese bravery in combat recounted here today, often against extreme odds, have moved all of us deeply. Writing the record of our VNAF valor in battle is necessary. Moreover, it should give pride to all Vietnamese for that spirit which I first saw in the early days with the troops way back in 1955 and then in 1962 and 63 in the provinces, villages, and hamlets. I saw enough to believe that the Vietnamese I knew always had the spark within them to rise to the occasion when they set partisan division aside and believed in themselves and their leadership. That the end result was not what you and we should have devoutly wished is not to detract in any way from that spirit. The United States of America, which is now your America, has already greatly gained from the inalienable Vietnamese spirit and will continue to do so even more into the future. Thank you.